My goal with proportions is not to be 100% accurate, right? I want to be able to sketch figures intuitively. I want to be able to do it in a kind of flowing manner where I can interpret what I'm seeing and adjust the design of what I'm seeing. Because I'm interested in things like the shape design, the edges, the gesture, and I'm trying to be kind of expressive with how I draw the figures that I draw. So the amount of accuracy that I want is basically just enough. So not perfect accuracy, I just want enough accuracy that it looks natural and it's not distracting. Some other methods will allow you to have way higher amounts of accuracy, but then I think that it's harder to do the kind of loose sketching of figures that I want to be able to do. So for example, if you want to you can take a photo first of all, and we become a photographer, right? But if you want to just go for like high accuracy, you can trace the figure, right? So some people will use a projector and they'll kind of trace the reference onto a canvas or whatever. And then the way that they're expressing themselves is more in the application of the paint and the use of color and paint and things like that. And so tracing the reference and doing the drawing that way just helps them to get an accurate sketch, and then their artistry starts from the painting process. So that's different to what I'm talking about today. You can also use a grid. So you put a grid on the reference, you put a grid on your paper, and then you kind of copy each box of the grid onto the paper. And you're going to get quite good, accurate results that way too. But again, that's not teaching us to intuitively sketch what we're seeing and get this natural, expressive result. So there are also other methods where you can take a long time to really accurately sketch what you're seeing. So you can do like drawings that take, 10 hours, 20 hours, up to 60 hours or something, where you're really, really accurately laying everything out, doing tons and tons of painstaking measurements. And a lot of beautiful, wonderful artwork. Beautiful artwork is created with all of these methods that I'm talking about. But again, that doesn't quite match what I want from my drawing skills, which is that kind of looser, more intuitive and free-flowing sketching of the figures that I want to achieve. So how to get to that kind of proportions is what we're going to talk about right now. So we're going to split this process up into 3 phases. The first phase is going to involve a lot more manual measurement and checking, right? So it's not going to be super free-flowing and intuitive, because we need that training, that phase of training before we can get intuitive. The second phase, we are going to try to be more loose, try to be more intuitive with it, but then we're going to check our work and do some measuring and correcting of what we did. And then in the third phase, once we're feeling a bit more confident, we're going to do that more loose, expressive sketching. Hopefully the proportions are going to be working pretty well. It might be a bit hit and miss, but it doesn't matter. And if we think it's gone wrong, it's all right. We're just going to start the next sketch, and we're going to do a lot of repetitions, lots and lots and lots of sketching. So those are the 3 phases, and let's start with phase 1 right now. So here we have a pose. There is so much stuff going on. There's so many little muscles, so many little bumps, so many features, a million strands of hair. We can't possibly try to draw all of this information all at once. We're going to have to cut through the noise and draw just a few big ideas. I'm not going to go through how to simplify a figure in full here, because I've covered it extensively in other tutorials, and I'm going to link those below. You can check them out after this. But to summarize, we're going to be thinking about, instead of the whole head, we're going to think about a simplified version of the head, maybe with a brow line. When it comes to the torso, we're going to first look for that rib cage egg shape idea. We're going to look for how the squash and stretch of the midsection comes off of that. And then we're going to look for this pelvis area pants shape. And then for the shoulders, we're going to come off the shoulders with collarbones. And so this simplified version of the figure is what we're going to try to draw. Notice here, so I've got these blue lines. Notice that what I'm doing is cutting through lots of little bumps and things like that. So when you look at this line from the armpit here down to here, there's obviously loads of stuff going on, and we're going to cut through all of that. When you come from here to here, we're going to cut through that. And we're just going for big, simple, straight lines when we're mapping out these proportions for this first phase of the exercise. At the legs, notice I've cut through so much. So here, if you get into like sketching, you might be tempted to kind of go, okay, so it kind of comes out and then it comes out here. And what happens is you accidentally over exaggerate all of these bumps as you go, and the whole thing gets real lumpy and bumpy. It's also really hard to, what happens is you get into these little lumps and bumps and stuff like that, and then you forget the big picture, and that's how the proportions go haywire. So what we want to do is just cut through all of that with a big straight line, cut through that. Later on, you can add these little nuances if you want to, right? And actually, for the initial sketch where I'm just mapping things out, I'm actually gonna pretty much cut half the calf off here and go a straight line all the way along the edge of the thigh down to the ankle. You could, if you want, break this up and go like this and make it 3 lines or something like that. But what we want to do is minimize the amount of stuff that we have to draw. And so these blue lines are what I would try to go for when I'm doing this exercise. And I would try to see the 3 big forms that I've put in the orange here. So the head, the rib cage egg shape, and the pants shape at the pelvis. And again, I'm going to link to how to see those simple ideas below. But for me, it's only by really understanding and seeing those 3 forms that I'm able to figure out what's going on in the figure, how the hips are pushed across, and all of this kind of stuff. So this is the simplification that we want to start to sketch. This is really crucial to be able to simplify first and measure and then start measuring. So the second part of this process then is measuring and checking stuff. So here's what we're going to do. We are first going to put down a vertical line through the middle of the collarbones. Okay, so the middle of the collarbones is this super important landmark, and part of the process of simplifying the figure was just looking for major landmarks. So if you check out those tutorials about how to simplify the figure, this landmark here, the middle of the collarbones, you'll see that's how we start to figure out where the rib cage is going, where the shoulders, the collarbones are going, and how the neck is coming up and the head is attaching to the rest of the torso. So it's this like central point, and it also is a really good point to put your vertical line through. So what's the point of putting a vertical right down through the figure? Well, this is a classic thing that a lot of figure drawing artists do, because now we can notice, okay, the hips are pushed across this far and this far relative to that vertical. The head is off to this side more along the vertical and less on this side, right? It's shifted across a little bit. So there's more on one side than the other. So I'm starting to see how things are, how far wide things are going relative to my vertical line. I can also see, for example, okay, the crotch is here and that is off to the side of my vertical line. So if I start sketching this pose and I'm just sketching, I've got the middle of the collarbones here and I'm starting to put the head, and then I go, wait a minute, I'm going to check my vertical. What very often will happen is, look, I've put the crotch just in line with this vertical. In other words, I've straightened out the pose too much. And then I go, okay, I need to do better than that. I need to push the hips across more, make it more dynamic, and get that crotch further across to the left because I'm checking that vertical. Now, if you're drawing from life or even from a reference, you don't always want to draw an actual vertical line on here. That's fine. You can hold up your pencil and create a vertical line that way. All right. Now notice here, I've also got some numbers. What I'm going to do, and this is what I'd recommend that you start doing early on in the process, is using head lengths, because sometimes it's hard to know what to measure, like what lengths to measure. and you can use head lengths as a good starting point. And later on, you can use whatever lengths you feel like, and you can as you get more confident. But in the beginning, head lengths are pretty useful. So what we're going to do is we've got one head length, and I kind of have to imagine, what I like to do is kind of imagine if the person's hair was all shaved off, right? So kind of got to imagine where their head comes up to, and then do it without the mass of the hair. So I've got one head length, and I'm going to keep going down the figure like this and figuring out, okay, so this head length, if I bring it down again, we're going to get down to here. So let me do that again. So if I bring this down again, we get down to about here. Do it again, we get down to about here, and keep going down. So what you could do is you could mark off these head lengths onto a reference when you're doing this exercise early on. If you're drawing from life, you can hold out your pencil and you can see, okay, the top of the pencil, I line up with the top of the head. I put my thumb where the chin is lining up to, and then I'm going to move down and see what points are corresponding to each head length going down the figure, okay? So once I've got this figured out, I know how far to each side of the vertical I need to shift things, and I know how long to make everything basically, right? So, you know, the crotch, we're gonna be having, like, this is one head length down, this is two head lengths down, this is three head lengths down, and this is four head lengths down. And so I want the crotch to be in between the third head length down and the fourth head length down, right? Does that make sense? So then what I want to be able to do is, just to help me figure out how wide to go, what I could add if I want to is I could go out to each side of that middle of the collarbones. I could go one head length out to the left and one head length out to the right, and I could check what's lining up with those verticals. So what I notice when I do that is, okay, so the inside of this foot is lining up with one head length out from the middle of the collarbones. So I come down, so this vertical line I started with, come one head length out to the side, that's going to be the inside of the foot. On the other side, the foot has to be further than that, a little bit further than that, right? I don't need to get too crazy with all of this and be like, it's 1.73 head lengths that way. I go, okay, it's one head length and then a little bit, right? Okay, so this is a simple way for me to start to map out my figure. So another thing I'd recommend trying is some bigger measurements as well. It's often, I think, pretty useful to start from a couple of big measurements. The head length is actually a relatively small measurement. So if you want to, you could go, okay, so from the top of the head to about the sort of pubic bone level, if I do that, and then I go down that length again, I go, that pubic bone level, the crotch level, is roughly halfway down this pose. So I can start with that big idea, and then I can start to map things out more closely with my head lengths if I want, or I can use the big measurements just to check things are working, right? Now, as I start to sketch the figure, I'm not just going to rely on my measurements. Sometimes, you know, we can miscalculate and get things wrong. I also want to trust my eyes, like, something is wrong here, this looks wonky, and then you can check what's going on. Like, you got to start to trust your eyes. If your eyes say this looks off, they're probably right, okay? All right, so let me come over to my drawing that I did this way. Now these days, I don't normally draw this way, but this is how I used to do a lot of drawings, is sketching things out. Okay, so right here, you see on the right-hand side, I've got a vertical line. Notice I didn't use a ruler. It's not perfectly vertical. The head lengths probably aren't perfect, but I've mapped out my initial vertical with head lengths. Okay. I start to put down, you know, the middle of the collarbones is a little bit further down from the bottom of the chin. So it's a bit lower than that first head length. And then I put in the head. I messed it up and had to do it again. So don't worry if that happens. And I just start trying to map things out. I map out my simplified figure, no details, according to the head lengths that I've measured. Now, as I do this, you'll notice that there's a lot of angles, okay? Because I've got the head lengths and everything, but if I'm going to map out this simplified figure, I need to get this angle about right, this angle about right, this angle about right, the angle across the pelvis about right. And so to measure angles, I can hold out my pencil again to that angle. And then I go, okay, so that's the angle of that line, and I can put it on my paper and draw it that way. It's actually surprisingly easy to get these angles wrong if we don't take a moment to check them. One nice way to check your angles as well is to compare them to a vertical line. So if I put a vertical on here and I think about, each of these angles and go, well, what's this angle across the pelvis here? Well, I can think about it relative to the vertical, or I could even think about it relative to the horizontal. So one nice way to understand an angle is to compare it to a vertical or compare it to a horizontal. All right, so I'm just mapping things out. I'm trying to keep things simple. And now let me tell you about one extra tool that I find really, really useful as I do this is abstract shapes and negative space. Okay, so what I can do is I can notice that the shape created around the torso and the hips, and I can think about the shapes created around these kind of big triangles and abstract shapes. And the reason that that's useful is that it's much easier to draw an abstract shape than it is to draw the figure, because we have so many ideas about what a figure should look like, and our brains will distort. As soon as you start drawing an eye, our brains will distort the eye. But if you're just drawing abstract shapes that don't have meaning to us, it's much easier to kind of be accurate with that. So I use those as well. And so then I'm starting to build up the figure more and more. You see with the legs, I'm just using like two big straight lines, trying to cut through all the details and the noise. So along the way, I started to map out shapes of light and dark. I'll link another tutorial about how to do that below. But one nice thing about the shapes of light and dark is you can think of those as abstract shapes too, and start to map those out in big, simple ways, like a bit like these orange shapes, but now it's about the shape of the shadow. So I'll do that. And then what happens for me personally is if I take this really measured approach, I end up, for me, a lot of artists don't, but for me, I end up with a stiff drawing that doesn't have, the sort of feel that I want it to. But what I can then do, if I do want to make it more expressive and stuff like that, I can then come back with my putty rubber and pull back the sketch, pull back this measured sketch, and then start to draw, and vary my edges and use more intuitive line quality and things like that. But I've got that underlying sketch letting me know where everything is. So this isn't the way that I like to draw now, but this is the way that I drew for a while to help me get a sense of proportions. Now this is phase one, this kind of manual measurement process. Now I'm recommending you start with a pretty structured thing where you go line through the collarbones and then you use head lengths and stuff like that. The second phase 1B, as you get more used to it, you can start to deviate from that and just basically grab whatever tools and whatever measurements you need rather than sticking to a sort of step-by-step process. So as I said before, the end goal with this, for me, is to not have to measure everything, to be able to do it more intuitively. And so the tools that I use have to be things that my eyeballs and brain can just do in the background eventually once I've trained them to. Does that make sense? So if it was a grid method, I could never just get my eyeballs and brain to just do that intuitively. But like checking relative lengths, like how long is this relative to that, and checking vertical alignments and checking angles, these are things that I have to do with my pencil and transfer them to the paper manually at first. But these are also things that eventually I can just ask my eyes and brain to do without me thinking about it too much, if I do enough practice. So with that in mind, the goal is being intuitive. I don't necessarily always want to stick to the same step-by-step process forever. So I'm gonna show you a way to do all these measurements, but we're just gonna do it a little bit more flexibly. So for this pose, what I would look for is, firstly, I would look at this. Okay, so what I have here is I've checked the angle across the shoulders, and I've checked the width of that line going across the shoulders. And then I'm just checking how other lengths relate to that length. So in this case, I wasn't using head lengths. You don't always have to use head lengths. You could use a different length. And in this case, I felt like the width of the shoulders would be quite good. You could also use head lengths, like there's no problem with that. But I want to be able to be flexible with how I do this. So what I noticed is that the width of the shoulders, if I go that length down again from that shoulder line, it's going to take me to the sort of bottom of the arm. And then I go down that length again, and it's going to get me to sort of just above the ankle level. And going up that length, about halfway up, gets me to the top of the head. One thing I really want to notice is how the head cuts across that shoulder line, okay? So here's just a few lengths that are going to help me get things roughly in proportion. And then from there, because I'm being flexible with the tools that I use and I'm not always using the exact same process, for this one, I'm going to go with lean heavily on that abstract shape idea. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm breaking down this pose into a big abstract shape for the head, like this big abstract shape for the head, then this abstract shape for the shoulders and the arms where the light is hitting the arms. Then I've got this shape and this shape. So it's kind of like this jigsaw puzzle of shapes. And so I know roughly how these shapes relate to each other in terms of lengths. I know what angles to check, which is these blue lines. And then in terms of how I'm going to build up my drawing, I'm using these abstract shapes. So the reason that the first process I showed you is a really good one, but just to show you that you could use a pretty different process and still achieve nice, accurate results. So this time we're really leaning on the idea of seeing simple abstract shapes in the figure. Okay, so let's take a look. So I start to map out those angles and lengths. And then I'm trying to see and find those abstract shapes. And then once this is the sketch these are the underlying marks that help make sure my proportions and everything are pretty decent. And from there, I can start to build up the shapes of light and dark, the simple shadow shapes, and start to build up some of the more, some of the more detailed information, or however you want to describe it. Okay, so that's how I build up this drawing. So in the second phase of learning, we're going to start to reduce the number of manual checks that we do and start to do things more intuitively. And then we're going to check things manually when we are stuck or when we think something looks wonky and we need to fix it. So it's probably still worth at this stage holding up your pencil to the vertical line running through the middle of the collarbones, because that's really going to help you get a sense of like how far across are the hips shifted, what's the angle of the head relative to that vertical. And now I might not do like the head lengths thing, but I want to try to get those lengths in by eyeballing it, and then I can check if I got it right afterwards. So when I stop manually measuring everything, I'm at risk of starting to stiffen up the pose. The manual measurements were pushing me to make sure that my angles were about correct. Now I'm like let loose, I get nervous, and I start to straighten everything out because I'm afraid. So what we want to do is kind of like a slalom ski. You ever see the slalom skiers, right? They're going down the hill and they've got these flags. And as they go down, they've got to go around the outside of these flags. And they don't try, if they go too wide, that's not fast. But if they go around the inside of them, then I think they probably get a penalty, right? So they want to go just around the outside of those flags. And so when I'm here, I'm like, okay, I want to push the head across. I want to push the hips across. And what I want to do is be like that slalom skier. I want to make sure I push it across at least this much, not too far so that it looks like a completely different pose maybe, but what I don't want to do is go on the inside of that and start to straighten things out. So it's like the hips are pushed across this way, the rib cage and the upper torso is pushed across this way. So as I'm bringing these lines down, I want to go on a little bit further out, just a tiny bit further out relative to the pose. Not too far, but just slightly further, just on the outside, just like one of those skiers. The one thing I don't want to do is start to go, oh, I'm a bit nervous, so I'm just going to start to straighten the pose out. And now I've got a boring pose which doesn't capture anything and it looks stiff and it's inaccurate. So I'm just going to try to lean a little bit more towards the more interesting side of each thing, right? It's like the pose goes this way, then this way, then this way. So my drawing is going to go like that and even a tiny bit extra, okay? And so here's me attempting to draw this pose intuitively without all the measuring and checking and stuff like that. And so what I could do then at the end of it, once I've finished drawing it, I'm just trying to kind of be roughly accurate with it here. But what I could then do is I could check stuff. Have I shifted the hips far enough across? Have I got the lengths reasonably right? One really, really useful thing to do is to take a photo of the drawing and flip it horizontally and see if it feels weird or wonky, and trust your eyeballs to notice that, okay? I'll also do the other pose in this kind of more intuitive way, just trying to get it reasonably accurate. So a quick note on all of these, this process takes time, right? So firstly, you're measuring everything and that takes time. You're probably gonna be making mistakes and correcting them, making a mess, and that takes time. And then in the second phase, you're drawing more intuitively, but probably getting things wrong because you don't have the measurements to help in the beginning. And then you can check things and correct it, and that takes time. So these are not time-limited exercises. You don't have to do these in like 5 minutes or whatever. I would take as much time as you need. But here's the one caveat. You don't take the extra time to add details. You use the time to map out that initial sketch with those straight lines and try to get it reasonably accurate. And so once you've got it pretty accurate, not perfect, so don't waste time trying to make it absolutely perfect, because that's not our goal. That is the goal for some artists, but that's not what I'm talking about in this video. You try to get it natural and looking good enough. You don't try to add details and get some crazy finish to it. You're just mapping it out, and it's gonna take time. So you give yourself enough time to get to that result. Don't rush it. And then on the intuitive, when you start doing the intuitive, the sketch might be quicker now, but you still don't want to rush it. You're still going to think about, you're still going to observe, take a moment to observe. You're still going to put your lines down fairly slowly as you go down. And then you're going to take that time to measure things. Now, if you're someone who's impatient like me and you like to kind of rush through drawings, you're going to have to pull yourself back and slow down, because your quicker sketches later are going to be so much better if you do take time over these exercises. Spend plenty of time on this. Once you're starting to notice that when you do your intuitive sketches, you come back, you check your measurements after that, and you don't have to correct too much, right? You're getting a lot of things in place. Maybe you're making some mistakes here and there, but it's not that bad. Move on to phase 3. So for phase 3, it's time to start to go more intuitive even. What you're going to start to do is sketch poses, get into a little bit of a flow state with it, keep it really, really simple. But now we're going to start to get into a more free-flowing state of drawing. When you notice that a drawing is not right, you don't worry about it. Maybe just do the sketch again and try and get it right on the second one. But you're going to trust your eyes. If your eyes think it looks pretty natural and good, you move on to the next one And now we're trying to get a little bit faster with it. And the goal now is to get pretty good intuitive sketches in proportion. And if they're not in proportion, you just try it again and fix it on the second go. And you're trying to get these sketches and move through lots of poses. And now we are trying to get a little bit faster with it. So this is in the third phase, because now what we want is lots of repetitions, lots of pencil mileage with getting intuitive sketches of figures which are reasonably in proportion. And so if you keep doing that, you're going to get more and more confident, and you can start to loosen up and get, you know, that nice gestural line quality and get those quick sketches in there. So this is the approach to proportions, which is really good for leading on to those more gestural and loose sketches of figures. But notice how in the beginning we started out with slower, more measured drawings, which is something that I think most artists have had to do to kind of train themselves to see stuff. So some of the stuff I'm describing in this video, it's easy to describe. You simplify the figure, then you do these measurements, and then you start to do it intuitively. It's easy to explain, but when you actually go to apply it, it's going to be frustrating and it's going to be hard. This is okay. There's nothing wrong with you if you experience that. If you'd like more guidance, so what we have is a full-on 6-week course called Figure Foundations, which is all about this, simplifying the figure down and then making these observations, how to simplify the figure across lots of different poses, how to understand that rib cage pelvis head relationship, and then what measurements and what angles and things you can start to check, what abstract shapes you can look for and how to look for that. We cover all of this in the course. One thing that's likely to happen is you may make some mistakes or struggle with something and just need a little bit of guidance, which is why in our course you can get expert feedback from myself or Marek, who's our really great instructor in the study group, and we'll be there to help. So if you want some support and guidance to really succeed with this and get these skills efficiently and quickly, I recommend joining our study group. It's really, really good value. And you can do the foundations course in there, and then you can actually move on and get into values and edge design. We have lanes, workshop and exercises, which were actually amazing in the end. I was super impressed with what he created for us. Look at these results from Jennifer. She started in October 2023. She worked on these ideas through our Figure Foundations course, made tons of progress there. Then she worked on simplifying values from our fundamentals course, which is also in the study group. She then started to work on her gesture skills. And by the way, your gesture drawing is going to be so hard until you've done this process I've described here. Then in April, she worked through Lane's workshop, which included ideas around edge design and things like that. The transformation across those months is really astounding. She got feedback, she got structured exercises all the way through, and that's the power of our study group. It's really affordable given that you get so much support, community, and a whole set of courses that take you through so many skills. It's really, really powerful. So check it out. There's a link below, and I'll see you in there. And in the meantime, here is a video that explains that process of simplifying the figure. And so this particular one is about seeing that rib cage shape. So I recommend you check that out. All right, see you over there.